Well, good morning to everyone. Hope you're having a good day. We were supposed to have rain and flurries, but it's dry outside right now. So we're having a delightful day here today. We're finishing up our series in Colossians, and we're at the final verse. And it's true to my nature, as much as I plan to kick this out in one day, I've decided we're going to spend 3 days thinking about this man named Paul who wrote the letter. I want to first look at what four things we find in verse 18 about Paul. Then I would like to back up on Wednesday, Lord willing, and look at Colossians chapter 1 and see more that we can learn about Paul. And finally, because it'll give us a nice round number, plus there's some other passages that I'd like to look at on Friday. I'd like us to look at some other key scriptures and think about this guy named Paul, who wrote this letter to a bunch of a fairly young church, fairly a group of young believers, relatively young believers, maybe a few years in the Lord. It's amazing what young believers can do when they're not told they need older believers around and they just go and do it by God's direction. And a church was started. But it was like all churches, not a church without some issues. And so this guy named Paul felt compelled to write to them. And that's what we've been reading and thinking about and studying and for the last, oh, I don't even know. I should look up. This has gone way longer than I thought it would. I don't know how many months ago. We're going to end up with about 80 episodes altogether on Colossians. I never would have imagined. But anyway, Paul was writing to this group. He didn't start this church, but he had led a fellow to the Lord who became a Christian, who learned under Paul, and went back and began speaking to his own people, leading people to the Lord. And then they formed a church, just a young group of believers wanting to honor the Lord and do the right thing. And so here they are, not without their struggles, but this is true of any church. But who is this Paul guy that we're writing about? Let's take a look at our verse here, Colossians 4:18, where we see it says, I, Paul, write this greeting in my hand. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. Just a simple little sentence. It's another one of those Bible verses that is kind of a throwaway verse unless you take time to sit in it for a while. I made myself slow down and sit in this verse for a while. At first, I thought, what would I? It's just a greeting. It's just a way of of saying goodbye and ending the letter. What in the world would I have to say about this? But the longer I sat in it, the more I saw it in it. I see four things about Paul, but there's a fifth thing that I wanted to share. I'm going to start with that actually. Those of you who come from a very relational culture and honor shame culture know how important greetings are and at both at the beginning and the end of any interaction. You know how it's important that when you go to talk to somebody, you need to ask them a question, you need to ask them a favor, you need to borrow something, you might need to talk to them about something, but you realize it's always important to start with something much more general in nature, just a greeting, because it's a way of expressing our humanity to one another. We're both human beings and we're in this together. So you wouldn't typically just knock on a door, get invited in, and just get right into it. You're going to sit and visit for a while. I noticed this when I was in my time in Lebanon, how important it was to slow down and do a little visiting before you got to the business at hand. So Paul, this is reflected in Paul's writings. He starts the book with a greeting. He's ending the book with a greeting. Now, what are these four things before I run out of time? Paul. I have Paul highlighted in yellow. Paul was not actually his birth name. This is a Greek version of his birth name. His birth name is Saul. Saul was his Jewish name. He is a Jewish person by background. He was a very zealous A Jewish person, well informed in the scriptures, served Judaism, studied Judaism, persecuted Christians. But it says in Acts chapter 9, if you want to read an amazing story of somebody becoming a Christian, a guy named Ananias is told to go and visit Saul after Saul had become a Christian, but he was very reluctant to do it because he knew Saul, the guy that would become Paul, he knew how he had been killing Christians and putting them in prison. In verse 15 of Acts chapter 9, we read this, but the Lord said to Ananias, go. This man is my chosen instrument to carry my name before the Gentiles and their kings and before the people of Israel, and I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. And so, as time moved on, in the scriptures, just a few chapters later, we see Luke, who's writing the book, transition from Saul to Paul. Why? Because Paul would be an apostle to the Gentiles. He wasn't the only one, but he was the driving force of bringing the good news of Jesus Christ from the nation of Israel to people all around the known world at that time. It's reflected in this name change. Paul was never the same after encountering the grace of God, and that included his very name and his purpose. He started life understanding he was a Jew. He lived his life defending Judaism at all cost, but ultimately God called him to be an apostle to Gentile people. Now, second thing, I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand. Why is that significant? Well, Paul didn't actually write down the rest of the book of Colossians. He had to have somebody else do that. And why is that? You just saw me take my glasses off. These are a wonder, even though my glasses are very smudged. Um, these are a wonder of modern living. People didn't always have this. And so people back then had eyesight problems just like we do now. Paul, in particular, had something very significant going on with his eyesight. I believe it's what he talked about in the passage where he talked about the Lord gave me a thorn in the flesh, in his body. And there's just numerous things that we read that went on in Paul's life. The book of Galatians that was written roughly, I wrote it down here somewhere in my notes, about 8 years before this one. In that book, he wrote about the fact that I wrote this letter to you in large letters. Why was he writing in large letters? Because he couldn't see well, and he needed to write in large letters for his own sake to be able to see it. Now his eyesight has continued to degenerate to the point that he's not even writing his own letters, but he is attempting to still write his own greetings at the end. Paul didn't allow this to hold him back. He simply took these limitations to the Lord, and he said, I need your grace in order to deal with this. And he did, and God used him. Third thing, Paul said, remember my chains. Paul is sitting in prison again. I can't tell you how many times this went on in Paul's life, the difficulties that went on in his life, how many times he was put in jail. Right now, he's in the process of working through the whole Roman legal system that would ultimately land him in Rome and ultimately lead to his being put to death. But in all of it, he trusted the Lord and he accepted it as the Lord's will for his life. And he sought to do all that he could in whatever the circumstance was that he found himself, even to the point of sitting in jail. Most of the books that we have from him in our New Testament were written when God gave him a timeout in jails because his life was very busy otherwise. And I don't know that he would have gotten around to writing these letters, but he had time on his hand time to reflect and time to write. Remember my chains. I'm sitting in jail, but I still want to be useful to the Lord, he's saying. And finally, grace be with you. The hard circumstances of his life, from eyesight to imprisonment, he did not allow it to embitter him. He was still wishing the best for other people in the Lord. And so he finishes this book with the simple phrase, grace be with you. Because at the beginning and at the end of the day, regardless of what you're facing, regardless of what you're struggling with, regardless of whether things are going well or things are not going well, you and I need the grace of God that is found in the person of Jesus Christ. And he was the one that Paul had committed his life to proclaiming. That's what we get, probably much more, from a final little verse at the end of a letter that's just meant to be a greeting, but we learn 5 significant things. I hope this blesses your heart. And Lord willing, I hope to be with you again on Wednesday, where we'll relook at the beginning of the letter and see what Paul has to say about himself there, what we can learn about Paul there. But between now and then, I hope you have a good couple of days.